Bob Huber was an important and admired figure in the field, and I'm sorry about his recent death. We'll do our best to make up for his absence by taking up some of the ideas that he proposed in his paper. I was originally to have been a humble lunch guest today, but I've been elevated to participate in this panel organized around Bob's paper, and I'm very pleased to join the other panelists. America engages Eurasia, a wonderful, large, and noble project. You might be forgiven for thinking that today's subject, funding, is not among the most scintillating themes of your summer agenda. It's a kind of gray subject on its surface, but in fact, it's connected to a very important, larger story to be told about knowledge acquisition and deployment and about our interactions with other parts of the world and not just Eurasia. Let me say right off that if you've read the Huber paper, that he's really quite right to point out that there was something of an over-identification of Russian, Eurasian, and East European studies as a Cold War enterprise, or at least I would say that to see it simply as a Cold War enterprise, though partly true, was also an exaggeration. A brief personal history to tell you how my own perspective was shaped. I began as a graduate student in the Harvard Soviet program in 1952 at the height of the Cold War, and at the same time I worked at the Russian Research Center as an assistant on the Air Force project on the Soviet social system. I completed the PhD in sociology at Harvard and went off to teach at Smith College, and then quickly moved to Princeton, where I taught courses on the Soviet Union, trained several PhDs in sociology, specializing in the USSR. In 1968, I became the founding executive director of IREX, the International Research and Exchanges Board, which was in charge of this country's principal scholar exchanges with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and I served there until 1992. During the 70s and 80s, I oversaw a major expansion of collaborative activities with social scientists and humanists in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. After the collapse of communism, I founded a new organization, Project on Ethnic Relations, which was involved in interethnic disputes in Eastern Europe, primarily in the Balkans, and I chaired some of the principal discussions that led to the compromises between Romanians and their Hungarian minority and between the Montenegrins and that country's Albanian minority. In Yugoslavia, I organized the first, I should say the last contacts between the Serbs and the Kosovar Albanians before the war broke out, as well as their first post-war contacts. In Macedonia, I chaired the follow-up conferences to the Ohrid Framework Agreement that followed the Albanian insurgency in 2001. So my career moved from scholarship to organization to private diplomacy, and it coincided with the rise and fall of the Cold War and its post-communist early aftermath. But above all, I was a fundraiser. Many of us who were involved in the development and of what used to be called Soviet and East European studies are still suffering from what I would call post-traumatic funding syndrome. When I was a graduate student, I used to start to get anxiety dreams about missing exams, something probably that many of you are familiar with. When I started teaching at the university, I started to have anxiety dreams about failing to give exams on time. But a couple of years after I took over or started IREX, these dreams were replaced by a nightmare about the disappearance of funding, and in which hundreds of scholars and staffers were left stranded when the money ran out. And that became my permanent dream from which I have never recovered. So it's kind of fun today to feel like a dinosaur whose bones are being exhumed and examined by a latter-day group which is looking back on some of those experiences. In any case, I was one of the members of that relatively small interlocking directorate of national and academic-based institutions that were responsible for the care and feeding of Soviet and East European studies. It was an era of very strong field solidarity, is the best way I can put it. There was a kind of communal national sense which involved the large research institutions, for example, the Columbias, the Harvard, the Illinois, the Berkeleys, and so forth, together with the leading academic organizations such as ACLS, SSRC, later on the Kennan Institute, IREX, of course, and we would meet together with some frequency to plot and plan and compare notes. Now, it's true that we sometimes invoke the Cold War know your enemy theme to enlist public and foundation support for our several enterprises, and why not? But this had more to do, I think, and this comes back to the point of view of Bob Huber's paper, I think in retrospect it had more to do with the way outsiders perceived the purposes of our work than our own view of it, which was focused on the development of serious scholarship and expertise rooted in the integrated and, to the extent possible, interdisciplinary and in-depth focus on a region, a country, or a culture. And I think I can honestly say that that really was the priority in our thinking, although the issue of the Cold War obviously could hardly be considered a minor one. But I cannot tell you how many times I was called upon to explain, not always successfully, to some of my State Department and United States Information Agency colleagues who provided a good deal of IREX's funding, that the study of literature was no less important to our understanding of Russia or Poland or Central Asia than counting tanks. But if I could divert them by advertising the tank counting instead of the Pushkin studies, even while spending some of our money on the Pushkin studies, that was okay by me. Alas, the end of the Cold War accelerated and combined with the long-standing and in some ways still unresolved tension between area studies and academic disciplines, especially in the social sciences. Area specialists were and are frequently scorned for not contributing to the scientific and generalizing aspirations of the traditional disciplines. And now that the countries of the former Soviet Union have finally joined the ranks of ordinary capitalist or semi-capitalist societies, it is perceived that there is no more need for special area studies. Let me declare that I am a permanent recidivist concerning area studies. I believed and believe that, and not just with respect to Eurasia, but really with respect to all other world areas, I believed and believe that there is no substitute for knowledge of a region or country built around a core of language and culture, and that the abandonment of area studies following the Cold War has been a serious and continuing loss, although I suspect to some extent that battle is over, in part because of the general decline in funding and the fact that it leaves less latitude for the kinds of things that we used to do in what have been called area studies. The root problem, in my opinion, and here I expose my intellectual prejudices and perhaps shortcomings, the root problem, it seems to me, is that there's an exaggerated self-regard of the disciplines, particularly in the social sciences, which in fact cannot and probably do not, have not, and probably cannot fulfill their scientific aspirations as templates for understanding whole societies and cultures, and whose insecurities only make them even more intolerant of an area approach. There's a kind of anxiety among people who are leaders in disciplines to affirm and show their scientific capacities. And one side product of this is to insist that people who are involved in area studies really ought to be paying attention to the science part of it and not to the area part of it. But it comes, I think, from, curiously enough, a form of continuing and probably an inbuilt intellectual insecurity about the disciplines themselves. I have to say that after my IREX experience, some of this prejudice was confirmed by what happened to me in the field. When I was with the Project on Ethnic Relations and working with the testosterone-filled people who were leading these ethnic conflicts, it was confirmed to me that the people who succeeded in bringing them together or managing them or understanding them were people who were or worked with people who had really very deep internal knowledge of those societies, and that who understood regional and cultural and in-country idiosyncrasies and specifics as compared to the generalizing contributions from disciplines such as political science and sociology and their illegitimate offspring of conflict resolution studies. They were always too much and too late. That is to say, we ended up well after the fact knowing more about things that and what we knew was not very useful. It was interesting and it was not irrelevant, but from a narrow applied point of view, it was really not a very much use at all. The trains had long since left the station by the time the academics got to it, and what they were writing basically was history and what I would call weak generalizations. That is, that they were true enough, but they didn't really always tell you what you needed to know or do in the field. So again, my own prejudices, the country-specific, area-specific, cultural-specific, but really in-depth knowledge is something which is certainly not absent in the American academic community, but there's not enough of it. And some of the things that get us into trouble in other parts of the world have come exactly from that kind of absence. I'll stop here, but I want to say that one of the resources that kept us on track during the Cold War and prevented us from doing worse things than actually happened had to do with the people who understood these societies in depth. They were moderating, cautioning influence, and that, however much they may have disagreed among themselves on interpretation, but they were anchored in those places and made a huge contribution to our national safety and well-being. And I'm sorry to see the evaporation of those efforts or the diminution of those efforts. So I'll stop there and appreciate being able to present a few dinosaur bones. Are we self-chaired, or am I to call on you?
Thank you. Hello, I'm Nina Bouis. Before I start, Alan began with our sympathy and condolences for Hubert. You may know that Yelena Bonner died this weekend. Today is her funeral. I'm here. I should be in Boston. It's a great loss. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm primarily a translator of Russian literature, and I've worked with many foundations that deal with the Soviet Union and the former Soviet Union space. I was the founding director of the Soros Foundations. George Soros enjoys being a maverick, and we were positioned as the non-foundation foundation. In fact, in our early days, people from Ford Foundation would meet with me, but only far from the building so we would not be seen together, in case I infected them with some kind of wild anti-bureaucratic approach, which would shake the foundations of the Ford Foundation empire. We spent a lot of time funding Soviets who had no other access to their Western colleagues and counterparts. We're sort of the flip side of what IREX was doing at the time, though we did, I believe, help IREX in their projects too, occasionally. No? No? There you go.
Well, George was on the board. George was on the board, but without money.
Oh, well, George had no money at the time. So what we did do was one of the niftiest things that we provided were travel grants for scholars to actually present their work at international conferences. The usual setup in the dinosaur days was that the head of the department got to go and read that person's paper. The nephew of the head of the department got to go, but not the scholar, because there were no funds in the department for this person to travel. So we set up a program that gave funds for that person to go, plus made sure an exit visa was granted. You may not know about it, but there were exit visas as well as entry visas to the country to which you were going, but you also had to get Soviet permission to leave the country. We would pay for their tickets. And the incredible impact for these people to meet their colleagues, to be able to have a fairly free conversation in their field was astonishing. It was very liberating, very undermining of the Soviet system. It was great. We felt it was very important. And one of the things that I wonder about now, because I don't have any data on it, but perhaps you in academia can actually think about this. We'll be talking generally in the afternoon, is that the setup? Have you dealt with your colleagues from Russia, say, or Central Asia? How has that impacted your studies? I mean, these used to be such closed, firewalled areas where American scholars did the best that they could without actually talking to their counterparts. Got to go on very carefully monitored trips and perhaps even spend a semester in their country, deepening their knowledge, which is so important because, as you know, America as a country is not very interested in things outside America. So to have Americans go and become expert in their area was very important. I want to know what happened to Americans who came in contact with Russians and other cultures in America who came as a result of the opening up of these exchanges. And now that, as Hubert, or maybe Cynthia, it was you who said that it's become a normal country. Maybe that was Blair. He's not here, so we don't have to mention him. How has the interest changed in those countries now that they're normal and not as I see it's still very interesting to some people. Here you are, which is, I think, a very important aspect of post-Cold War relations. So that's one of the things that I think we could touch upon. And another is how, but again, it's the flip side, which is how have American studies changed in these countries as a result, which is perhaps not in our discussion today, but I would really like to know what your impressions are of what's been going on now that there has been this openness between academics on both sides of this firewall. We at Soros found that it was incredibly invigorating to academic studies to have this kind of exchange. We did it not only with academics, we did it with lawyers. We set up a program with the the American Bar Association, to bring young lawyers to intern. We had an entertainment lawyer from Riga. We had people working in a prosecutor's office in Florida. We had defense attorneys learning about the jury system. These were things that were new then and important to the future generations of lawyers to come. So the seeds that were planted by organizations, not just foundations, of course, the more formal programs, are bearing fruit, and I would like to take a little time later to perhaps talk about it a little. I'm with the Sakharov Foundation now, and we're still very concerned about the lack of human rights, civil rights, that need to be developed further. These are areas that continue to trouble those of us who, during the Cold War, worried about democratization and peace. There's still a lot to be done, and I hope that everyone here will be working toward those same goals. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks to the organizers for the invitation. I too, all right, so the organizers won't get their thanks recorded, but they know that they're in my hearts. I too would like to add a few words to the memory of Bob Huber. He was a friend and a colleague, a powerful voice in Washington in the American academic community for our field. He will certainly be missed. There will be a memorial service or a memorial ceremony of some kind at the AC's annual meeting in November. Yes, he certainly, it was a complete shock to learn of his death. I'd also like to follow my predecessors and say a few things about introducing myself. My academic training was in well, several different fields, including classical languages and philosophy, but the PhD was in political science, in East European studies, study of the transformations in 1989 in Eastern Europe. Since then, I have been mostly working at the American Council of Learned Societies as now a director of international programs. I will say that what you have represented here are intermediary organizations, aside from perhaps the Schroeder Foundation, which is a foundation that has its own funds. The other organizations represented here are don't have funds of their own, but organize activities to support various fields, including this one, and that'll become important as I go on to talk about the basic subject. I want to say that two of the programs that are most relevant that I run at ACLS. One is been supported by Title VIII, State Department, for East European Studies, funding American graduate students and scholars in language training and on countries of Eastern Europe and their languages. The other one is a very different one. It's an international program that actually works internationally. It's called the Humanities Program in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which for 12 years provided research funding to scholars in those 3 countries to do their work there. So the idea was to build the sort of intellectual infrastructure in those countries, help sustain it, and actually in the period, the last 12 years, to encourage scholars to stay in the field. There were so many attractions, distractions. Clever people who knew languages could make a lot more money in the private sector or by emigrating, and we were trying to encourage people to continue their academic work. All of which is to say that I have become very interested in comparative academic cultures. And it's interesting to look at America from other countries and to look at other countries from the United States. Something that Nina said, Americans are not very interested in what happens in other countries. It's absolutely true, but we need to ask, compared with what? If you compare to the interest of academic communities in other countries with the rest of the world, America comes out actually pretty good, because there are sort of robust area studies fields, et cetera, et cetera. To sort of segue into the main topic that we're discussing today, which is funding for the field then and now, or funding for Eurasian studies then and now. I'd like to start by examining a couple terms here. Funding. What does this mean? And I think we need to divide funding for basic research, that is direct funding for research, that is scholars getting grants to do their work, from something that's not quite so visible, but is very important, and what I want to stress in my talk today, and that is the funding that develops a infrastructure for scholarly communication, that creates a field. That's the second term I want to examine. So what is a field? Is it certainly the people working in it, the individuals working at their institutions where they have commitments and responsibilities. Blair?
Apologies.
But it's also their connections across institutions. And it's that sort of infrastructure of communication that I think is not only useful, but it's actually essential. There can't be a field without that. A field does not consist of individuals working on a particular topic. It consists of those individuals who have vehicles for communication. And I use the term scholarly communication. It's probably more familiar as an arch synonym for publications. But here it actually is using it in the natural language signification. That is, people talking to one another, people exchanging ideas, discussing professional issues, intellectually, or organizing their intellectual projects. And the third term I want to focus on is Eurasian, because I'm going to talk more about Eastern Europe. It's my sort of métier. It's where I come from, where I studied, or what I studied, and where I've spent quite a bit of my working career in the last 15 years. But I think it's also useful to take this kind of sideways glance at the topic, because we can talk about what it takes, what it means to be a field, what it takes to be a field, and what funding needs to do in order to sustain the existence of a field. In the United States, fields of study, be they disciplinary fields or area studies fields, are supported principally by and through, I should say through, learned societies. A learned society is the infrastructure, or provides most of the infrastructure for scholarly communication. And learned society comes from the, it's our middle name at the American Council of Learned Societies. And it's an old-fashioned term, but I think it's a useful one. Scholarly organization, professional organization. It's a voluntary, self-managed, self-financing membership organization of scholars of all ranks in and out of academia, whose purpose it is, simplifying, to hold an annual meeting for presentation and examination of new work, to provide opportunities for discussion of professional matters, including the effectiveness of graduate training and availability of research support, and to publish a journal of record for the airing of significant research and intellectual issues related to the interests of the Society's members. I tried to make this a formal definition. The point isn't to we could quibble about it, but I want to say that East European Studies never had such a learned society and does not have one. The field of Russian, Soviet, post-Soviet, Eurasian, East European studies does have such a learned society, and I think it's underappreciated for the work that it does and for the opportunities that it provides for communication. People go there because they want to see old friends, but they don't always appreciate how what it would be like if it didn't exist, if we didn't have that opportunity. So let's go back to East European studies. It's a small field. It exists against the background in the shadow of this larger field, and has always done so and always will. Before, and here I will contend a little bit with what Bob Huber wrote about the significance of Cold War funding for the field. For the field of East European studies, the Cold War funding that was provided by Title VIII specifically is absolutely crucial. A field would not exist in this country, even in its sort of limited way, without that funding. Before the 1980s, Alan's just stepped out, but he reminded me that well, I was going to say, before the 1980s, there were no national organizations dedicated exclusively to East European studies in this country. There was AAASS, but that was, with the advent of Title VIII funding, there were three that appeared. One was the ACLS Joint Committee, and then just the ACLS committees on East European studies and language training. Gave out grants year after year, and those grants for 25 years have been coming, and almost everyone in the field of East European studies has had some association either receiving one of those grants or sitting on the committees. There was the Kennan Institute, Woodrow Wilson Center's East European Studies Program's Junior Scholar Training Seminar, where graduate students would come and discuss their work. And there was the appearance of the journal East European Politics and Societies. So these three institutions serve the function of a learned society for the field. And the crisis of, we who have been receiving funding from Title VIII have thought of it as an annual crisis for the last, decade. Thinking that this might be the last year for Title VIII funding, and somehow it's still here, although the prospects are growing increasingly dimmer and more restrictive. But what I want to put before you is the hypothesis that a field depends not just about money to do research, but an infrastructure which is something like a learned society, which has those learned society functions, and that the crisis for East European studies is not only that individuals might not have Title VIII funding available for them, but that the infrastructure of scholarly communication would be severely damaged. The Junior Scholars Training Seminar would no longer take place, so that opportunity for graduate students to become socialized into the field, to begin to sort of get a sense of what, how their work fits into the wider picture would not be there. And the ACLS committees would also not be, couldn't continue their work. And again, the work is certainly in the first instance and of first importance is giving support to individuals to do their work. But, and here I want to maybe just expand, talk a little bit about what the committees do, because it's a absolutely crucial function in the maintenance and further development of a field, and that is the discussion of what counts for quality at the committee meetings. A national committee which reads applications from institutions all across the country has the best possible insight into the new work that's being done, new approaches, new trends, new topics. It is a forum at which those are critically evaluated and are, and so through the decisions that the committee makes, they are able to comment on what's happening in the field. If that venue is not available, if there isn't such a committee, if there isn't such a competition, and these are represented here are organizations which are in the business of organizing just such national competitions. If that's not there, then sure, individuals can apply for other funding. They can apply through their university, they could apply through, but they're not applying within a field which has that kind of oversight function over what the norms of quality, the sort of development of a working consensus on those norms that scholars use as they do their own work, and then as they peer review the work of others. I should also mention in this regard East European Politics and Societies, which is beginning to take on a larger and larger role in East European studies because it's the only national, it's the only self-sustaining national institution for this very small field. So again, East European studies is an example of what it means to be a field. It is an example of a struggling field, and it is an example of how important it is to have this, to have venues, to have opportunities, structured opportunities for scholars working in the field to be able to discuss issues such as norms of quality, what the new trends are, okay, so that's if I were to answer to pose and answer my own question about what it takes to maintain a strong field of studies. It is that, this scholarly infrastructure of communication. Thank you.
I want to echo Bob's incredibly insightful points about the historical trends and the motivations for targeted funding for Eurasian studies and its inextricable history with the Cold War. At the same time, I want to think more currently about our current precarious, shall we say, funding environment for European studies, or Eurasian studies, both at the level of the university, where cuts are substantial, and where in a quick survey after the vicious ripping apart of Title VI, a quick survey of 7 of the center directors. None of them were getting any additional funding to compensate for the decline in Title VI funding from their universities. None. So universities benefited from having Title VI funding all those years. This year, we've got a 47% decrease in that budget. Not one of the 7 center directors that I was able to contact is getting a dime additional from their university to compensate for this loss. Again, focusing on that idea that universities see this as something, if it's important, Washington will write you a check. Certainly not coming out of my department, or, my college budget. The second thing about the precarious nature of this has to do with the extraordinarily small, shall we say, confidence that many of us have in terms of the future security of Title VIII. And I think that this is also an important element of Bob's legacy. He worked tirelessly to really employ all forces possible to protect Title VIII funding. And I wondered, I know I didn't understand as an academic, that Title VIII is extraordinarily small. We're talking about $5 million, which in...
Less.
Yeah, well, about. I'm hopeful, right? So it's a little, it's a bit under 5 million. From that, you've got to take out the administrative costs for running the program. And so really, in terms of the money that's given out, you're talking, wasn't it 4.2 this year? $4.2 million. The average size of an NSF grant, one NSF grant in sociology, is $490,000. They give out 80 on average every year. So let's think about, and that's just in sociology. That's just one of the divisions within NSF. So when we think about this in balance, this targeted funding is really quite small, but it's extraordinarily precarious. And one of the reasons why I think it is so precarious, and I could be completely wrong coming in at this from a different, perhaps generational perspective, is that as scholars, and I put myself in this category as well, I have certainly enjoyed funding from Soros, enormous funding from IREX, and I'm extremely grateful, and Kennan, and SSRC, which I now direct. As scholars, we should have been doing, as well as administrators from the other side, we should have been doing a better job on documenting the success of these funding programs. And we have also done ourselves a disservice by not advertising and documenting the rigor of the selection processes, the importance and the quality of the research that is generated from these specific funding lines. Once that is done, I think it's extraordinarily simple to communicate to your universities and indeed to your departments that yes, getting an IREX is a big deal. This is an incredibly prestigious award. Yes, getting a research grant from the National Council is extraordinarily prestigious. And look at the people who are on the selection committee. That yes, an SSRC award as a postdoc is a stamp of academic excellence. And it's not just disciplinary excellence, it's area studies excellence. And say it unashamedly and say it very strongly. We haven't done a good job with that. We've been a little too apologetic, I think. And at this point, it's extraordinarily important that we work together, both academics as well as funders, to really carefully and convincingly articulate that this is not a second-class line of funding and that it's here for a specific reason. And it's here because the demands of becoming an expert in this part of the world are higher. And you've got to have the language, you've got to have the travel opportunities, you have to have the networking. And if you don't, this is a critical area of the world that we will simply not know anything about. And I think that's an argument we can make effectively, and I would encourage us all to really redouble our efforts to make that both at our department levels, at our universities, but indeed nationally. I think that's really important. For my part, one of the things that we did last year at the SSRC is to take a big view and do a 15-year retrospective. Where are our scholars now? And there are 4 things that the graduate, the dissertation write-up awards and the pre-dissertation awards that SSRC has given out in Eurasian studies really accomplished. The first thing is we could prove With these grants, our students no longer faced a handicap in completion of the dissertation. On average, people who have some sort of area expertise, according to the Chronicle of Higher Education, take 2.2 years longer in the social sciences, economics, political science, and sociology. I really think economics is an empty cell, but that's what they said in the report. If they're doing primary work in a foreign language, 2.2 years longer. When I looked from 1995 up until 2011 with SSRC, there was no statistically significant difference between the graduation time of our recipients and their non-area studies colleagues. That's easy enough to measure. That's something that made Title VIII sit back and really think, wow, we're really effective. But unless we gather that information and unless we convey it in a convincing fashion, we're in bad shape. So we really need to look at what happens in terms of completion time. The second thing we need to think about is what happens in terms of commitment to the field. 90% of our dissertation write-up award winners in the past 20 years still work in Eurasia as their primary focus. That says a lot. People's interests change, and that can be a wonderful and inventive and exciting thing, but to have 90% still stay in the area is pretty impressive. Now, granted, some of them have just recently finished, so it's hard to say what will happen in the long term, but we're really working on retaining scholars in the field, and that's important. The third thing that I think we need to focus on a little bit more is that oftentimes these sorts of focused funding translate into larger academic processes and projects that gain either wider institutional support, funding from the Carnegie Corporation, the Ford Foundation, the National Science Foundation, or the National Institutes of Health. And so they can be seen as a step in a scholarly process. How many NSEER grants, which tend to be fairly modest in size, actually have translated into later grants from other national funding organizations or later projects that major foundations have seen fit to fund? We haven't done enough work, I think, in terms of really documenting and carefully articulating how successful our funding has been. And the fourth element I think that we can do a better job on is really articulating in a very, very adamant fashion a reconceptualization of this fabulous term that everyone takes to heart, policy relevance. Having just run a workshop with great thanks to Blair and the Kennan in DC with our fellows, I thought it was a great time to invite some folks from the State Department over to see the fellows present their work. These are really terrific graduate students from 6 different disciplines who are doing all sorts of fascinating work. And I'm like, okay, so the State Department's coming. They're going to want to talk to the guy who works on Chechen refugees, right? They're going to want to talk to the woman who's doing political economy in Eastern Europe. They're going to want this, that. I send them a list. As always happens, of course, they said they're going to show up at a certain time and then they're not there, right? So they come for the Buryat Buryat linguistic anthropologist, which I thought was going to be just a home run. There was no question. They came in and she's talking about code switching. She's talking about how Buryats negotiate the use of Buryat language and Russian language in everyday life and in what spheres they use what words and how this comes up. And she's deconstructing jokes, basically, throughout her talk. Fabulous scholar from the University of Michigan. I was astounded that the representatives from the State Departments were completely hook, line, and sinker in. They were fascinated. They were able to link this together and talk during the coffee break about what this means about identity, about the importance of multiculturalism in the Russian Federation, about all the things that I think the people around this table would hope they would find as important. And so what was really, for me, the take-home point and the thing that I wanted to share with the fellows during this workshop is that bombs and rockets aren't always policy relevance. and that we can be, as opposed to being apologetic and saying, well, if we do a little bombs and rockets, then we can have a couple linguistic anthropologists run around in the provinces. I think what we need to be able, and again, this is a difficult conversation, but we need to be able to convincingly articulate to our academic communities, to our institutional communities at the university level, but more importantly to national funders, that knowledge of a region with the geopolitical significance of Eurasia is policy relevant, and that knowledge may take the form of linguistic analysis, it may take the form of literary analysis, it may be couched in 15th century history, but to take a broader idea about knowledge, just as now Secretary Clinton is pushing the State Department to take a broader look at power. We can be part of that conversation in Eurasian studies. We have the legacy. We were privileged during the Cold War. That privilege is gone now, but I still think we have a case to make in terms of showing why this funding is important, why it is of value to the academy, and more importantly, why it is of value to national interests. Thanks very much.
Well, I apologize for being late. It was foolish of me to rely on the dependability of American public transportation at 5:15 in the morning. But I'm here, and I'm here, really, I don't want to be anyplace else. There are many reasons for that. Edward Castiness, I don't think I've ever said this about Edward, but Alan, I know, had his own relationship with George Kennan, and George could be a kind of prickly guy, and there would be this moment when we would argue about what we should be doing. And I discovered one time trying to find some subject to talk to George Kennan about that wouldn't be an argument, about how I was ruining his namesake institution. And we started talking about New York Public Library and about Edward. And it turns out Edward was a hero for George Kennan. And so to be associated with anything that's associated with Edward is an honor. I look down at the table, I see Alan Kassof, who was as instrumental for my career as anybody. And I got the grants because Alan secured the money and ran an organization that was really serious about the field that was once Soviet and East European studies. I'll say a little bit about what it is. But finally, Bob Huber was my closest friend and colleague in the field. And Cynthia's at SSRC, I was at SSRC, and then Bob followed me. And we fought many of the same battles we're talking about here. And to have an opportunity to comment on, to start off with Bob's paper and to think that he's still around, basically, is really an honor. When I was walking up the subway steps outside the gate, I realized, I hadn't really thought about this, but 42 summers ago, I started learning Russian here. I was an undergraduate at the University of North Carolina, but I was from New York and I wanted to learn Russian. So I was walking up those steps to learn Russian. And then I walk in, I don't think Megan is still here, but I met Megan downstairs, she met me. And we started talking about what she's doing and her interest in Polish, Ukrainian, Russian cultural relations. And kind of the juxtaposition made me realize not only how different the world is, but how different the intellectual enterprise of studying this region has become. And you all have my remarks, and I'm going to make some of the same points, but I want to do it in a slightly different way. I take the point of normalization of this field very seriously. But normalization, as exciting as it is intellectually, means people don't care what we do. People aren't going to fund us. People don't care what happens in French studies. They really don't care what happens in German studies. You all are attracted to this region for the reasons people are attracted to studying Latin America or Asian societies, because it's a complex region which seems to contain within it both questions and perhaps some answers to the nature of the human condition. When I entered the field, when I was coming here 42 years ago, there were other motivations for studying this region. The Soviet Union was enemy number one. Russia is not enemy number one for the United States. There was national security. There was the whole policy relevant debate. I do want to say about your meeting at the State Department, Cindy, you shouldn't have been surprised. Yeah. Who are those analysts? There are probably as many PhDs around that table as there are around this table. They're frustrated academics. And part of what I want to say is I want to talk about how fields are conversations. And we shouldn't assume that because somebody sits in the State Department that they're not part of the same conversation. We're actually on the same sides of the barricades against their sort of bosses. Absolutely. And I think that that really is important. And the problem is, one of the ways in which the Soviet studies field was different, despite all the heroic efforts of Alan and others to ensure that this wasn't the case, this was a highly politicized field because national security was at stake. So I don't lament the passing of the old days. I'm going to say something about funding in a moment. But I really do think this is a healthier field, a more normal field. Now, Andrej was absolutely right. When I came in, he was talking about the importance of funding and organizational structures for fields. And there's no doubt that that's important. But it does seem to me that an academic field is first and foremost a conversation. And when we think about Soviet studies and even Russian studies, it has, and to some extent East European studies, I'll get to draw a distinction in a moment, this has been a very truncated conversation. 42 years ago when I was coming here, it was truncated in that we didn't really interact with our Soviet and East European colleagues. The American enterprise of studying Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union was a self-contained world in which Americans, well, we talked to Europeans from time to time, particularly the Brits, maybe the Germans, but not really because nobody bothered to learn German, and certainly no one read anything in French. But so we basically talked to ourselves. So it was a truncated conversation then. I think it's a truncated conversation in a very different way now. And I think it's a generational divide. I think people who entered the field after the collapse of the Soviet Union really don't feel as if they have to go back and read anything that happened. They're all Christopher Columbuses. Mm-hmm. And therefore, when you pick up books about subject X in our field, there are rarely conversations with the work that came before. There's a very recent paper that Bob Huber sent me, probably the last paper that National Council put out under his guidance, and it was on a subject I knew something about, the politics of Leningrad. There's not one reference to any work in that paper by anybody who wrote about that city before the author entered graduate school. But this isn't unusual. So that's the second way in which it's a truncated conversation. And the third way, of course, and I gather Alan has already talked about this, is we've lost the area studies discipline debate. It's over. It's a tragedy. I think it's a tragedy for the United States that we don't value area knowledge, not because of Russian studies, but because of the Middle East, because we have young Americans walking down streets not understanding what's going on around them and nobody around to tell them what's going on around them and getting killed. That's the tragedy. But that battle was lost long ago. We are now, whatever we do, Cindy said it, you have to learn statistical methods and the local culture. People have to be engaged in the discipline. And this has led to another normalization of the field, like Latin American studies, like, I'm thinking, African studies, different studies of Asian societies. There are no economists who study the Russian economy as a distinctive field. the reason Alan remembers this, one of the first missions at Title VIII was to support economists. They all went off to the World Bank and became economists. They couldn't get jobs in universities, but they're actually probably doing much more important things. The study of Russian politics is through a disciplinary paradigm, for better or for worse. So the field becomes, like Latin American studies or African studies, a field in which the kind of contextual knowledge that we're interested in becomes part of the discipline. History, literature, sociology, anthropology, particularly anthropology. There's a really exciting emergence of anthropology over the past 15 years in this region. So I want to say that basically this normalization is good news. It's helped us advance the conversation. But I do want to add a couple of caveats. Cindy makes a very good point that more money at one level is better, but at another level it isn't. It creates dependency. This is a field that luxuriated in funding. Andrej's right. We have had an annual Title VIII crisis every year for the past 15 years. But that's the good news. There's a crisis to have. And thus far, we've carried the day in large part because of Bob, but because of many people. So I think one of the ways in which it wasn't a normal conversation is that it really was, it was a gilded conversation that was pushed in certain directions because of money that doesn't exist in other fields. A second way is when you think about French studies or African studies or Japanese studies or Korean studies, the preponderance of work in those fields doesn't take place here. It takes place in those societies. Who's most interested in French history? The French. Who's most interested in Japanese history? The Japanese. Because of the Soviet overhang, the study of the social sciences in the region we study has many, many battles that are still being fought. And that has made for a truncated conversation. It's still, we all have wonderful Russian colleagues and Ukrainian colleagues. It's a little bit easier in Eastern Europe, and in this way, I think Eastern Europe is kind of past the barrier. But it's still very, very difficult to engage Russian academia writ large. We have individual colleagues now, but we still don't have the institutional linkages. And I think that affects the conversation in ways that does make us different. Another way is who funds Japanese studies? The Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science, the Japan Foundation. The Goethe Institute supports German studies. Up until recently, the Russians haven't supported Russian studies. Now there's Russian World, they're trying, but there are really lots of issues. I think the East Europeans may have been a little bit further ahead in this. Again, this is a way in which East European studies is different, but they don't have a lot of resources. So I think that that's another way in which the natural conversation is truncated and leaves the study of this region in a very awkward position. And finally, there's the reaction of, and here I think the further east you go, the stronger this reaction is. But I was just at a conference on higher education in the region in Vilnius, and there was a big, angry discussion among Polish scholars about the same issue. There is, with the challenge of nation building and the rise of battles over national identity, there are lots of scholars and public intellectuals in the region who really could care less what we have to say about their history and their societies. They're engaged in a conversation among themselves. So I think we have moved and we've normalized in a certain way. We should be proud of that. It's exactly what Edward and Bob Huber and Alan and many, many other people wanted to see happen. And yet, it's a very difficult transition that's not helped at all by the world around us. It's not helped by the fact that we live in a country that really doesn't care much about the outside world unless we think that they can kill us. And nobody's worried about Russians killing us. They should. They can still obliterate the country in 30 minutes, but nobody thinks about that. We live in a country which is rapidly defunding anything to do with intellectual life. This leaves us in a very challenging position. And it's particularly challenging for a field that had this elaborate infrastructure that was built up with money. But we really should, I think, step back and look at the new technologies. I mean, if anybody's on Facebook, Russians, Ukrainians are all over Facebook. You know, literally, we can engage, at least with individual Russian scholars, in a real-time way in which we couldn't in the past. One of my closest colleagues in urban studies is in Yekaterinburg. That would have been unthinkable 42 years ago when I was trying to learn Russian. This is the good news. And finally, I think you all know this because you were interested enough and intrigued enough to come spend your summer here. But this is a region which poses really challenging questions about what it means to be a human being in the 21st century. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact, despite all the challenges we have and all the difficulties in convincing somebody on the 8th floor of the State Department, let alone in Congress, that we're policy relevant. We really have profoundly interesting questions we can explore. So I want to say that the challenge is, yes, to keep funding going. But the purpose of that funding isn't just to support the Kennan Institute or the SSRC or ACLS or IREX or the National Council. The purpose is to expand the conversation about this region so that it begins to really complete the cycle of becoming normal. And we need to recognize that as it does so, it's going to become smaller and a little bit more challenging materially and so on and so forth. But there really are great opportunities out there. And again, I think Megan has left, but when she was talking about her interest in Russian, Ukrainian, Polish cultural relations, I was thinking, how exciting that must be to be entering a field where you can wrestle with those questions and not, write a dissertation about Soviet trade unions, which is what I did. Or a book about Leningrad shaping a Soviet city that came out just as it was no longer Leningrad and no longer Soviet. So I think when we think about the field, we should think about those opportunities as well as the other challenges. Thank you.